In this lecture, I plan to deal with how Philip of Macedon ended up conquering Greece. And that conquest was unusual in one way, in that Philip did not attempt to incorporate the Greek city-states within his kingdom. And we'll have to reserve the actual arrangements to a separate lecture. But what I wish to cover today is the period from 346 BC down to 338 BC, the Battle of Chaeronea. In 346 BC, Philip of Macedon could really congratulate himself on pulling off some stunning achievements. Given the fact that he had come to the throne in a crisis, his brother had been slain in a battle against the Illyrian king, Bardilius, and Macedon looked on the brink of disintegration. He had built Macedon up into the leading power of the Greek world in about 12 years or so. This included his famous army reforms, which I discussed in a separate lecture, the economic and social transformation of Macedon, and above all, his adroit diplomacy and very, very fine generalship that won him control of Thessaly, the Greek cities of the Chalcidice, large sections of Illyria and Thrace, so that he had doubled the size of his kingdom by the time he concluded a peace with Athens in 346 BC. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many scholars, Philip was probably content with what he had. He had no desire in 346 BC to become involved in running the various Greek cities south of Thermopylae, that is, the Great Boeotian League and Thebes, Sparta and the various cities in the Peloponnesus, and above all, Athens. Instead, he wanted treaties. Particularly with Athens, he had a treaty, the so-called Peace of Philocrates, and in the event that Philip should expand his interest into Asia Minor to launch an expedition against the king of Persia, the Athenian fleet would be invaluable. He probably saw Thebes and Sparta more as rivals for control of mainland Greece, but again, in 346 BC, Philip was content with what he had. And he couldn't have been more content in the success of settling the Third Sacred War, in which he came out as the guardian of the great sanctuary at Delphi, and he had the controlling votes on the religious league, the Amphictyonic League, that ran the International Greek Shrine. The question is, how did this settlement fail? Between 346 and 338 BC, Philip found himself at war with the various Greek city-states, primarily Athens and Thebes. In Athens, there was a very, very strongly anti-Macedonian party led by Demosthenes and Hyperides, who were regarded as two of the leading orators in Athens. He did have friends scattered throughout the Greek world, but in the end, Demosthenes was able to misrepresent Philip and to point to Philip as a threat to Greek freedoms that resulted in a coalition that went down in defeat at Chaeronea in 338 BC. To answer this question of why we ended up with a war, how we ended on the road to Chaeronea, it's important to look at 2 points. First is, what were Philip's ambitions in the years immediately after the Peace of Philocrates and the settlement of the Third Sacred War? And then the second point is exactly what was going on in Athens, because the Athenian political scene was extremely complicated, and really the Athenians had not been so divided politically for a very long time. Well, as to the first question, Philip, in many ways, is a really admirable king, and he has been the subject of a number of recent biographies over the last 30 years, which has reassessed his reign and has really put him in a new light. Until this last generation of scholars, Philip was usually seen as the suppressor of Greek liberties, at least in the English-speaking world. Most British and American scholars were reared on the traditions of the Athenian democracy. They had all read the orations of Demosthenes, and for the longest time, Demosthenes was taken at face value. And Demosthenes was often regarded as the champion of Athenian liberty, of Athenian democracy, and in many ways, Philip was the negation of that Athenian democratic ideal. German scholars always had a better appreciation of Philip, starting with the great scholar Droysen in the 19th century, who saw Philip engaged in state building. German scholars loved to make comparisons between the Prussian monarchy and the creation of a national German state. And so they could see in Philip a figure who in many ways prefigured the Hohenzollern dynasty, and particularly Otto von Bismarck and his amazing diplomacy to create Germany. In any event, Philip himself really gets high marks, and current scholarship now thinks of Philip as, well, he may not have the title great the way his son does, but he may deserve it. And I often ask as a trick question to my students, who knows who Constantius Chlorus, Ethelwulf, and Frederick William are? And I usually get blank looks, and my response to that is they are the respective fathers of Constantine the Great, Alfred the Great, and Frederick the Great. So one of Philip's problems was to have a son named the Great. And unfortunately, he does not hold that title, but one could almost set up a society to award it to him. By 346 BC, he had done what no Macedonian king could ever have done, and that is to forge an effective kingdom that was now the arbiter of Greek affairs. In that regard, that gets us to that question of what did Philip intend after 346 BC? He saw the destinies of his kingdom to the north and to the east. He spent a good deal of time in the immediate aftermath of the Peace of Philocrates, waging campaigns along his northern and eastern frontiers. And he scored a major success in the conquest of Thrace, which was completed by, say, 342 BC. And Thrace is a huge area encompassing much of what is today Bulgaria, and these bellicose and warlike peoples were incorporated into the Macedonian state as a special province. The Greek term is a strategeia, that is a generalship. This was a significant achievement. It changed the balance in the Balkans. In addition, he was already looking eastward into Asia Minor. I mentioned that many Pan-Hellenists, such as the Socrates of Athens, as early as 380 BC, called for a national war against the great king of Persia, the conquest of Asia Minor, today Asiatic Turkey. That would include the liberation of Greek cities on the western and southwestern shores, and also the conquest of regions such as Lydia, Caria, Phrygia, long in contact with the Greek world. These Anatolian peoples had many cultural and economic ties, and to Socrates and other Greeks, it would be logical to set up Greek city-states or colonies in these regions. And this area had long been disaffected from the great king of Persia. I had lectured earlier how the governors in these regions had repeatedly rebelled from central authority. Philip was apparently looking in that direction, and we have several indications of this. For one, the satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia is the district. It's the region along the Sea of Marmara today, and the capital was at a town called Deuskalion. That satrapy was very, very important. It guarded the straits. That is the crossing at the Hellespont and the Bosporus, the various crossings from Europe to Asia. Artabazus was the satrap who was ruling in this district. He had come to control this area shortly after the great satrap revolt in 360 BC. He staged his own revolt in 358, and after about 5 years or so, checked out and found a reception at Pella, that is at the court of Philip, where he arrived with his daughter Barsine. She'll reappear in the story later on. And this Persian satrapal family, which was one of the leading families in Persia, it was linked to the royal family. They spent some time in Pella, some would argue as much as 10 years, and Philip undoubtedly treated them with an eye to an alliance. Eventually, Artabazus made his peace with King Artaxerxes III and returned to Persia, and we find him loyally serving Darius III against Alexander the Great. There were other moves to contact local rulers in Asia Minor. The Hectomanid rulers in Caria, petty princes, dynasts, who ruled in various cities of Western Asia. The Greeks would call them as tyrants. And Artaxerxes III had good cause to be concerned that Philip's next move would be into Asia Minor. And from Philip's viewpoint, that would be logical. These regions were extremely wealthy and rich. They were linked to the Balkan regions of his kingdom. And furthermore, he could avoid dealing with Greek city-states in most of these regions. They were used to monarchy. Artaxerxes III, therefore, sent various missions, and contacts were made in the Greek world, usually through these people known as proxenoi, that is, guest friends to the Persian king. And Artaxerxes had contacts in Argos, in Thebes, in Athens, and his agents were constantly encouraging the Greeks to oppose the Macedonians. For anything that kept the Macedonian king tied up with affairs in Europe was to the advantage of the great king of Persia. And anyway, Artaxerxes just simply wanted Greece to be a very docile mercenary market. In 343 BC, he hired some 13,000 Greek mercenaries for the reconquest of Egypt. So Philip mucking around in Greece and conquering this area would affect also Persian military power. It would deny the great king access to the mercenaries. Philip himself was content to be on generous terms with Athens. He saw Athens not only as a cultural and intellectual center, and there was something to this, because the Macedonian court was consciously attempting to be Phil-Hellene. And Philip tried to inculcate these notions in his son Alexander. That is, to make him a Macedonian king who appreciated Greek civilization, Greek aesthetics, and Athens was clearly the cultural center of the Aegean world. But he also had another pragmatic reason for this, and that was that Athenian fleet. If there were to be an invasion of Asia Minor, Macedon essentially had no fleet. And the Macedonian kings never really wanted to launch a fleet, because fleets have to be rowed by large numbers of sailors who turn out usually to be citizens. And then when you do this, you get things like democracy and in opposition to monarchy. So fleets were never really high on Philip's agenda. Armies were something else. But the navy was something that the Macedonians would never excel in. And so, from 346 down to 343 BC, in my estimation, Philip really did abide by the terms of these general peace proposals and was more than willing to indulge the Greeks their liberties and their traditional autonomy, the freedom to pursue their own constitutions, live under their own laws, so long as they behaved themselves and didn't pose a threat to Macedon. On the other hand, the Greeks had very mixed opinions about Philip. Now, opinions in the Greek world differed depending on your city-state. Many of the lesser cities, especially in Peloponnesus, actually looked to Philip as a protector. This is a point that's often neglected if one spends his time reading the orations of Demosthenes, and even his opponent Aeschines in Athens, who tended to favor peace with Philip, because they concentrate on Athenian affairs and they see everything through Athenian eyes. But many of the lesser city-states saw Philip as someone to substitute for either Thebes or Sparta. In the Peloponnesus, the city-state of Argos, the Arcadian League that had been created back in 370, 369 BC, and above all, Messene, which had once been part of the Spartan state but had been liberated by the Thebans in 370, 369 BC, they looked to Philip for support. There were other lesser states in central Greece that did the same, and they felt that an alliance with the Macedonian king would protect them from encroachment by the great states, Sparta, Thebes, or Athens. The Spartans had as their policy the recovery of Messenia and the subjugation of that area back to Spartan rule. So obviously the Messenians looked to Macedon. On the other hand, Thebes apparently was very suspicious of Philip. So was Sparta. They both aspired to control central and mainland Greece. And the Athenians too, or at least part of the Athenian population, listened to Demosthenes, Hyperides, and the other radical Democrats who harped upon the fact that any peace with Philip, no matter how generous, was ultimately a deal with the devil. That Philip, no matter how Phil-Hellene, no matter how accommodating he was ultimately in a superior position. The peace of 346 BC was a major concession on the part of the Athenians. They recognized the loss of Amphipolis, which Philip had taken back in 357, and the Athenians had spent nearly 80 years in an effort to recover this wayward and very important colony. Philip's advances in Thrace and the overthrow of the Thracian king Chersobleptes, which finally ended in 342 BC when Thrace was conquered, these moves by Philip threatened an ally of the Athenians. The Thracian king had long been linked to the Athenians, and these moves brought Philip dangerously close to the Hellespontine regions and the grain trade. And so Philip, with his superior military position and with his many conquests, his moves to the east towards the Hellespontine regions meant that ultimately the Athenians enjoyed their autonomy and their freedom as a gift of the Macedonian king. And in this regard, Demosthenes was correct. Any arrangement with Philip in the long term would probably compromise the Athenians. And so Demosthenes spent his entire career after 346 BC torpedoing that peace treaty and repeatedly attempting to forge a wider coalition of Greek city-states, notably Thebes. And as I mentioned, Thebes was a very, very hard sell to most Athenians, in a coalition to oppose the Macedonian king. Well, maybe Demosthenes' overall perception was correct, but on the other hand, he really overlooked some very important tactical issues. And these were points that were understood by Demosthenes' opponents. And Demosthenes' opponents did not form a single political party as we understood it. They were critics. And in some instances, they could persuade the Athenian assembly to follow their resolutions, their policy. And they included certain men, notably Socrates, now very advanced in years, who had championed Pan-Hellenism, had championed the idea that the Athenians and Spartans should wage this common war against the Persians in Asia Minor. But that was a policy back in 380 BC. And by 346 BC, Athens had traveled a very long way from those optimistic days. Socrates himself made a major shift in policy in 355 BC when the Athenians ratified a peace with their wayward allies. He stood forth as a very important Athenian politician who argued that the days of empire were over, that Athens is now a cultural center, that her achievements in oratory and art were what civilized the world. He harped upon the notion that Hellene was becoming increasingly a cultural term and that the Athenians would lead the way in this redefinition of Hellene. He was supported by other members of the Athenian elite, notably a man named Eubulus, I mentioned earlier. Eubulus took over control of the Theoric Fund, and this is the fund that is used to distribute money to the Athenian citizens. It's used to fund public projects, and it essentially represented money collected by taxes levied on the propertied classes. In contrast to Athens of the 5th century BC, the Athenian democracy in the 4th century BC did not have an empire. They could not raise tribute, taxation, from their allies. That was written into the charter of 378 BC in the Second Athenian Confederacy, no tribute, thoros, the word was off limits. And second, the Athenians no longer controlled the Aegean, so they could levy various types of customs duties and taxes on trade, which is what they had shifted to in 412 BC. So those revenues were just not available. Essentially, revenues had to come from taxes collected in Attica, the territory of Athens, as well as, and these would be import-export duties, as well as direct taxation on the property classes. And Eubulus made it quite clear that the Athenians just didn't have the money. In 346 BC, one of the reasons for concluding the peace with Philip was not only because, you couldn't beat Philip militarily, but the Athenians just didn't have the money to wage the war. So Eubulus was followed by a number of prominent Athenians, particularly members of the highest class, who saw war as ruinous to their property, as potentially playing into the hands of radical Democrats such as Demosthenes and Hyperides, who would also call for who knows what next, more democratic reforms, redistribution of wealth. There were all sorts of bogus charges raised against Demosthenes along those lines. So the Athenian public was really very divided on these issues. Demosthenes struck some very, very powerful emotional chords in the assembly. The Athenians resented that loss of Amphipolis. They still had a sense that they were the imperial city-state, even though that empire was now fast eluding them. On the other hand, Eubulus, Aeschines, Philocrates, the man who negotiated the peace, pointed out to some very pragmatic and hard-headed conclusions on this. They were also supported by some of Athens' leading generals. Phocion, who held the generalship 45 times in his career, was a conservative but a very loyal follower of the assembly. He repeatedly pointed out that the Athenians just didn't have the military power, although he was a very fine tactician. And he was present at Chaeronea, even though he was against the idea of fighting Philip in 338 BC. The same could be said of the Athenian general Chares, who eventually finds himself as one of the major commanders at Chaeronea. So within the Athenian political elite, not only the orators, but the generals, there was a lot of strong opinion against opposing Philip and living by the peace. It took Demosthenes, it really took all of Demosthenes' efforts to depict Philip not only as a monster as a tyrant, as a foreign ruler, comparable to King Xerxes of Persia back in 480 BC. And these images that especially come out in the 3rd and 4th Philippics, which are delivered in the late 340s BC. These images and associated orations with similar images paint Philip as the national danger to the Greek world. And this is what helped move the Athenian assembly along. He also vilified the reputation and the motives of his opponents. Aeschines and Philocrates were attacked. Demosthenes had excelled in forensic debate earlier in his career, especially in civil suits, and we have a number of cases. In fact, he successfully got his friends to prosecute Philocrates for corruption. In signing the peace, Philocrates was banished, although the peace was ratified. He launched repeated attacks against his political foe, Aeschines. And by 343 BC, Demosthenes was gaining the upper hand. Philip was largely, unconcerned about all these events. These were really rather petty events in Athens, day-to-day political wrangles, orations, debates that were pretty much beyond Philip's comprehension, and at least in the details. Once the Athenians made a change in policy, he understood that. But the day-to-day workings of the Athenian assembly and the Athenian government were not much of Philip's concern. In fact, the reason he had the peace was so he didn't have to deal with this stuff. But by 343 BC, Demosthenes had gained the ascendancy in the assembly. And he came up with a amendment or rectification of the treaty in 346 BC. And this was an amendment that came up when Philip had sent a mission into Athens headed by a fellow named Python of Byzantium, a Greek diplomat in Philip's employ, to settle some minor issues. And what Demosthenes did in the assembly is essentially sidestep that whole issue and raise the point that there were problems in the original peace, and he proposed something known in Greek as the epanorthosis, the amendment. And what it did is it amended one point in the Peace of Philocrates in which the language was changed from hekterus echein ha ekousin to hekteros echein ta heauton. Sounds pretty close. The first phrase, the original phrase, meant each signatory holds what he has. That means Philip at the time had Amphipolis, that's Philip's. To change the language to each signatory holds what is of his own, that is what belongs to him. That means the Athenians could raise the issue of Amphipolis, and they had 5 previous treaties that indicated it was Athenian property. Well, this thing was sent up to Philip. It arrived at Pella. The Athenian mission was essentially thrown out of the capital. Philip was he's probably enraged. He believed that the Athenians were at this point just impossible. And I think by the summer of 343 BC, Philip's attitude is all bets are off. If the Athenians want war, he'll be glad to give it to them. At this point, Philip starts making moves in northern Greece, which the Athenians rightly see as dangerous to their interests. That includes a war against the Thracian king and the eventual conquest of Thrace. In 340 BC, Philip lays siege to cities on the European side of the Sea of Marmara. This includes the cities of Byzantium and the city of Perinthus, both crucial cities on the grain route. The cities at this point were independent. The Athenians send aid to these cities in the form of mercenaries commanded by Chares. Even the Persian governors in the area support these cities. And the siege of these cities, which are record-breaking because Philip showcases some of his first siege engines, including artillery, the sieges actually fail. Philip doesn't have a fleet to blockade these cities effectively, or not a large enough fleet. But nonetheless, they're seen as moves by Philip essentially to cut that grain route and put Athens in his power. Now, in Philip's case, these moves were brought on by the attitude of the Athenian assembly. And Philip also gave money and supported governments, usually oligarchies, that is, ruled by the propertied classes, in Euboea, the great island, which was a federal league and ally of Athens, among city-states in the Peloponnesus, notably the strategic city of Megara, Argos, Messene. Demosthenes in his later orations points to these, and he calls Philip polypragmasune, that is constantly in motion, constantly doing things to undermine Athenian interests. There really isn't an English word for it. You'd have to use a German word like Beschäftigkeit or something like that. He also calls Philip's moves polemos apolemos, a war that is an undeclared war. And under those circumstances, the Athenians and Philip of Macedon are drifting ever increasingly on a collision course. In the complicated fighting that went on in the Hellespontine region in 340-339 BC, Philip was able to seize one of the Athenian grain shipments. Some 240 ships were seized by the Macedonians. It was embarrassing. It got Chares in a lot of trouble back at home. He was lucky he wasn't prosecuted. And this meant that wheat was not coming in from the Black Sea, and many Athenian citizens would go hungry. That event was it. That was the event that gave Demosthenes the opportunity to convince the assembly to declare war on Philip. And we actually have an inscription that records what happens, and it gives us all the various names of who was in charge of Athens at the time. Well, now, as to the fact that it was in the time of Theophrastus, who held the archonship after Nicomachus, that the stelae, that is the stones with the inscribed piece of Philocrates, were destroyed. It is manifestly sufficient to quote Philochorus, who writes as follows in the course of his 6th book. When the people had heard the letter, after Demosthenes had urged them to war and had himself proposed the decree, they voted to destroy the stelae that had been set up to record the peace and alliance with Philip and to man a fleet and to put themselves on a wartime standing. So the inscription was, with the treaty, was destroyed. We're told this in this literary account, which is paraphrasing the inscription. It records the substance of the inscription. And this was a very dramatic act because treaties represented oaths sworn to the gods, and the destruction of that stelae meant with the Athenians, it's war. Demosthenes immediately approached the Thebans and began to conclude an alliance with the Thebans, with Corinth, other cities in the Peloponnese. Approaches were launched to Sparta. The Spartans said, we'd be glad to come, but we have 2 provisions. First, we're in charge of the alliance, and second, give us back Messenia. And the Spartans, keep resonating with these appeals through the whole 4th and 3rd century BC. It's really marvelous. The Spartans are still living in the 6th century BC in some ways, and never quite got over the Battle of Leuctra. So they are essentially conveniently annoyed. In early 339 BC, Athens and Thebes were at war with Philip. Well, the question is, how is this war to be waged? Fortunately for Philip, through a coincidence of events, there was yet another sacrilege committed to Delphi, this time by their immediate neighbors known as the Locrians of Amphissa, who are a small state near Delphi. They plowed up some sacred land, and Phil, who controlled the Amphictyonic League, had himself voted as the commander of all forces to crush the Locrians, which would take about all of 10 minutes by the Macedonian army. And so in a whirlwind campaign, the Macedonian army marched back from the Hellespont, crossed Thermopylae, absolutely beat up the Locrians in the winter of 339-338 BC, and appeared in central Greece. Philip seized the city of Elatia in Phocis, fortified it. The Phocians all turned out in force, hailing Philip, and later got their indemnity renegotiated down and some of their towns restored. And the Thebans and Athenians were taken by surprise. Demosthenes really steps forth in his finest hour in terms of oratory. He encourages the Athenian assembly to march out with the other allies and oppose the invader. And in the spring of 338 BC, Philip outmaneuvers the allied army, enters the region of Boeotia, and at the town of Chaeronea, the battle I had discussed earlier, one of the pivotal battles in Greek history, probably on the 2nd of August, 338 BC, the Macedonian army crushes the alliance of the Athenians, the Corinthians, and Thebans in a grand battle in which literally the Greek citizen forces are wiped out. Demosthenes himself fled the field. He threw his shield away and ran. 2,000 Athenians were captured. The sacred band was wiped out. The Thebans took very, very heavy losses. And by the evening of August 2nd, 338 BC, Philip was now master of Greece. One could call him a reluctant conqueror in some ways, but there's no doubt he held the fate of the Greek cities in his hands. What he would do next was actually a surprise to the Greek city-states, because once again, ever the pragmatist, Philip came up with a very generous settlement which allowed him to harness the energies of the Greek city-states and avoid the onus of direct rule.